In part 3, we again left off at a point where Steven Callahan is undergoing some serious stress, physically and mentally. He's becoming increasingly attached to the school of Dorados that have followed him for weeks. He lost a tooth and has developed a bit of a blind spot in one of his eyes. The last fish he managed to spear, he speared it so perfectly that it wasn't even able to put up a fight. But he was unable to bring it aboard his raft. He watched as his food sank down to the abyss and disappeared, never to be seen again. And in a different part of the world, the Coast Guard has been made aware of Callahan's disappearance. With that brief recap out of the way, let's get back to the story. March 19th, 1982, day 43. Callahan is still distraught by the Dorado that he lost the night before. In his eyes, the death of that fish was to no one's benefit. Since he wasn't able to eat it, the killing was pointless. Even though spirits are down, he still prepares himself for another day of fishing and trying to survive. Sure enough, the school of fish appears under the raft, and at some point he's able to spear another one. The only issue is that this fish, in particular, put up a huge fight. Not only did it break free, but it also tore open the bottom tube of the raft with the end of the spear. To Callahan's dismay, the damage is massive. A 4-inch hole isn't something he's able to immediately patch. Soon after the rip occurs, the raft settles down to the point where it is completely and solely supported by the top tube. 3 inches separate Callahan from pure ocean. He's essentially floating in the equivalent of a kid's inflatable pool. He spends hours attempting to patch the hole, but all of his attempts and fixes are extremely temporary. March 20th, 1982, day 44. Callahan is out of dried fish. Getting into position to fish is almost more than he's able to manage. At some point, he's able to spear another fish, but disaster strikes yet again. Somehow, the fish he speared managed to fight hard enough that it was actually able to unscrew the tip of the spear and leave with it. He quickly gets to work and lashes a knife from a Boy Scout utensil kit to the now dull-ended spear. He does tie the handle of the knife separately and in a manner so that even if the knife is pulled off the end of the spear gun, he won't lose it. Later that night, he manages to spear one more triggerfish. It seems he did a good job making his spear. March 22, 1982, day 46. On this day, unbeknownst to Callahan, the Coast Guard has canceled their broadcast, notifying others about the Napoleon solo. For all intents and purposes, the active search had just been suspended. The Callahan family will not be made aware of this until April 1st. Not exactly the most appropriate prank in my opinion. March 27, 1982, day 51. In the morning of this day, the patch that Callahan has inserted into the 4-inch hole from a few entries prior blows. The raft sinks down and all of the fish he'd managed to stockpile up to this point has gone rancid. His body's covered in hundreds of sores that manage to provide him with more than a steady supply of pain. The sores are almost constantly oozing and popping. At this point, Callahan averages less than 4 broken hours of sleep a night, eating less than 2 pounds of food a day, plus he's constantly working during all of this time. He's beginning to feel the early stages of panic settle in. March 28th, 1982, day 52. Callahan startles awake. The ghosts that haunt his dreams tell him it's his time. They all reach out from the abyss, looking as if to drag him down to his watery grave.
I want to live.
His eyes are heavy, signaling that it's time for him to go to sleep one final time. In this dazed state, Callahan reverts completely to basics and is somehow able to patch the hole that's been giving him issues and even build a water catching system. April 1st, 1982, day 56. The heavens have decided to drop a light shower of rain and possibly test his water catching system. The sun peeks out through the gray and gets the solar still working. The only issue is that it still keeps slumping over. Callahan deduces the hole in the still must be getting larger, because it needs to be blown up roughly every 15 minutes. The good news is that the still seems to be producing a good amount of water. The bad news is that the amount being produced is too good. There's no way it's pure water, and Callahan even says by this point he's trying to ignore the fact that the distilled water is tasting more and more salty. He's desperately thirsty. He decides that he needs to try and water down the tainted pure water with the salty distilled water, and in the end he has a cocktail made up of water, rock salt, and vomit. He describes it as a concoction befitting a test of manhood in any ancient tribal ritual. The family is notified that the active search has been called off, and the family begins to conduct their own search and rescue missions. Back in Callahan's raft, it's dark and he can't sleep. He feels the putrid concoction sloshing about in his stomach, and he thinks to himself,
My God, I've poisoned myself.
April 2nd, 1982, day 57. In the morning, Callahan is somehow able to catch his 11th triggerfish. He's back in the fight for his life. He doesn't know how much longer his still will last. He's affectionately named the 4-inch hole that he's been struggling to patch Buddha's belly button. Buddha's belly button constantly grows larger. He needs to start collecting as much water as possible. April 3rd, 1982, day 58. Looking through a sextant he'd made with pencils, he deduces that they're at 17 degrees latitude, but it could be off by a degree or more. For those who don't know, a sextant is an instrument for measuring angular distances used especially in navigation to observe altitudes of celestial bodies, as in ascertaining latitude and longitude. Far away, Callahan's family is keeping the search and rescue going. They begin to do calculations of potential drift routes his emergency raft may have taken him. In hindsight, their calculations were actually pretty accurate, because out of the two positions that they've calculated, one of them was only 100 miles away from where he was. The Coast Guard doesn't seem to take any interest in the family's theories. Surely someone that's been missing in the ocean this long would be dead, right? April 4th, 1982, day 59. Everything in the raft is saturated with salt. Nothing is really dry until the noon sun comes out and begins to blast everything with its heat. The only position Callahan doesn't find excruciating is kneeling. Kneeling with the sun overhead, he collapses from the intense heat. It'd be so easy for him to go to sleep at this point. He manages to wake himself up, but things are looking grim. He doesn't have any fresh food. He needs food, so he forces himself to endure the pain of kneeling for hours. With his patience, he's rewarded with 5 fish caught. One of the fish, however, bites through the distillate collection bag, and he watches as the fresh water dribbles over the side of his raft and back into the ocean. April 6, 1982, day 61. Off in the distance, Callahan sees a huge cluster of sargasso weed floating with the waves. As he gets closer to the raft, he paddles over and pulls some of it on board. He picks through the layers of the floating weed and finds lots of shrimp, as well as small fish and crabs. Another thing of note is that weaving in and out of all the sargasso weed is trash. So much of it that it looks like an ocean of trash and plant matter. Callahan says that he drifted through this trash ocean for hours. The triggerfish that have been following him for his journey go into a frenzy with the new-found source of food. Callahan also eats the crabs and shrimps that he pulls up from the vegetation. He drifts through this massive patch of weeds and trash well into the night. April 8th, 1982, day 63. The sea is steadily producing 5 to 6 foot waves with a pretty constant wind at 20 to 25 knots. Callahan is only able to think about food and water. At some point, he does see another ship, but it's approximately 5 to 8 miles away by his estimations. He waits for the right moment and pulls the pin. His final parachute flare sent up into the air and begins its slow descent. He has 3 flares left by now, and they're all handheld. He watches as ship number 7 sails away. On the bright side, he manages to catch another Dorado, so he can relax on the food for a couple days. April 10th, 1982, day 65. On this morning, he notices the Dorados are gone and a different species of triggerfish has made their way to the raft's vicinity. For some reason, Callahan feels a bit stronger on this day and actually returns to his yoga routine. His hemorrhoids have reappeared, so that may have been the driving factor behind starting yoga again. I don't know if it was on this day, but at some point between now and Callahan's next entry, he manages to catch a bird. April 12th, 1982, day 67. This is the anniversary day of Callahan's marriage with his, at the time, wife. He reminisces over the times that she'd warned him that he'd eventually die at sea. April 16th, 1982, day 71. Days have passed between entries and Callahan is increasingly becoming depressed as well as pessimistic. By his calculations, he should have reached an island days ago. He begins to worry that maybe he drifted between the islands and passed them up completely without him noticing somehow. His final solar still is broken beyond repair and no longer functional. Luckily, he has, by his standards, a full stock of water. Rainfall is his only hope at collecting water at this point. Things are looking grim. April 18th, 1982, day 73. A big triple tail has been hanging around the rubber ducky for the last couple days. So far, all his attempts at catching it have failed. While he may be failing at catching fish, he isn't when it comes to catching birds. He snatches them up when they land on the raft to take a rest. At this point, Callahan's energy is so low and his body so fatigued that he finds just getting into his fishing position to be painful. He's only able to hold the pose for about a minute, but even still, he's able to catch another Dorado. He does spot another ship and attempts to signal it with one of the flares, but like every other time, he goes unseen by anyone that could help. He starts building an elaborate water collection system. April 19th, 1982, day 74. The building of the water collection system carries over into the morning of April 19th, and he uses aluminum tubing from the radar reflector and his final solar still for components. He estimates that if he finds himself in a heavy rainfall, he'll be able to collect roughly a gallon of water. April 20th, 1982, day 75. Callahan watches as clouds roll in from the east. This is the moment he was preparing for. A heavy rainfall is going to hit, and water won't be an immediate issue for the next few days. He swallows regularly just thinking about it, his dry lips and tongue rubbing together. He looks with dead eyes as the clouds deviate course to about a mile from his position. He sits there and watches 4 huge columns of rain dump literal tons of fresh water into the ocean. The storm he prayed for has missed him. He fantasizes about being able to drink a mouthful of water without depleting his rations. April 21st, 1982, day 76. As he wakes up, he's shocked by what he sees. It's green, and lots of it. He's near an island. After months of only blues and grays, the color green is more than a welcome sight for his dry eyes. He quickly begins to make preparations for land because, as far as he's concerned, one way or another, his time adrift ends today. He doubts he'll be able to walk or even crawl to get help once he's on land. He turns on the EPIRB and finally opens up his medical kit. He applies creams and ointments to his sores and makes himself a diaper to wear. He throws out pieces of junk that he doesn't need so that he can make room in the bags to bring all of the necessary items with him, like the first aid kit. He hears the sound of an engine approaching and after a while sees a 20-foot-long wooden boat that's been painted white. Aboard the boat, he sees 3 dark silhouettes and Callahan begins to wave to them. They wave back, and finally, after all the near misses, he knows now he's been spotted and that they're coming for him. Aftermath. It turns out that the three fishermen noticed the birds circling in the sky and knew that there'd be fish in that area. When they made their way there, they found Steven Callahan and the rubber ducky. They struggle to communicate with each other at first, but with a bit of time and patience, they tell Callahan that he's near the island of Guadalupe, and Callahan insists that they finish their fishing trip. They catch all the Dorados that had been following Callahan for his entire journey. While they fish, he takes the time to drink all 5 pints of water that he'd been carefully collecting, saving, and rationing for himself. Once the fishing is done, they head to the island. The fishermen tell him that they'll actually be bringing him to an island named Marie Galante because it's closer. Callahan learns just how lucky he is because the fishermen actually never really fish near the eastern side of this island. It was just by chance that they happened to be there that day and spot the cluster of birds in the sky. Throughout Callahan's 76 days adrift on the open waters of the ocean, he traveled 1,800 nautical miles, and 9 ships did not spot him despite using flares to try and signal them. He's brought onto the island of Marie Galante, and the locals take him in like one of their own and show him complete hospitality. He's almost immediately hospitalized, and in the hospital he learns that during these 76 days he'd lost 44 pounds or 20 kilos, which at that point was approximately a third of his body weight before that unforgettable night that he had to abandon the Napoleon solo. Surprisingly, with the power of radio, Callahan's family was actually made aware of his rescue within an hour of it happening. The 3 fishermen that saved Callahan from his nightmare are named Paulinus Williams and 2 brothers named Jules and Jean-Louis Paquette. After a bit of time in recovery, Callahan's parents visit him on the island, where they try to convince him to fly back home, but he has other plans. He intends to actually hitchhike via boat up to Antigua and recover any mail that's been sent to him and then fly back to Maine from there. His parents accept that decision and actually help him prepare in the meantime. During his time spent on the island, he'd struck a deal with a captain named Nick Krieg. The ship he captains is named the 3 Legs of Man 4, and after weeks spent in recovery, he feels ready. He collects his things and hobbles down to the concrete pier, and he waves goodbye to his new friends and family that he'd made on the island, and is shuttled out to the 3 Legs of Man 4. Once he's brought aboard, the bow is turned toward the island of Guadalupe, and they set sail. The island of Marie Galante getting smaller and smaller as the distance grows. He's truly a sailor at heart. Now, Mr. Callahan continues his work as an offshore sailor, naval architect, author, editor, and associate to sailing magazines. This incident is featured on an episode of I Shouldn't Be Alive, titled 76 Days Adrift. His story is also featured on an episode of the British television series Extreme Survival, as well as an episode of the History Channel's series Vanishings. In the making of the 2012 movie The Life of Pi, director Ang Lee asked Callahan to be a consultant on living aboard a life raft, and the lures and other tools seen in the movie were actually made by Callahan. In the end, Steven Callahan's journey is a terrifying one. None of us ever want to find ourselves in his shoes or boat. It's a journey that he says he wouldn't volunteer for again, but it was given to him and was the first time in his life he'd ever been truly humbled. It changed the way he looks at life and improved his relationships with the lessons he'd learned during his voyage. Yes, his story and circumstances he found himself in are terrifying, but it's also a beautiful view into how truly tenacious the human spirit can be. It shows us how powerful our will to live can be, even when thrusted into the most dire of situations. The information I've given throughout this story is only a fragment of what is presented in the book written by Mr. Callahan. If you find this entertaining or engrossing, then I'd highly recommend just buying the book Adrift 76 Days Lost at Sea. And with that, we bring Adrift to an end. That concludes this episode of the podcast. I hope you enjoyed the episode. If you enjoyed it, then like, subscribe, and share the podcast with your friends. This is Myths, History, and D&D, and I hope you tune in next time.